Welcome to Mormon Land, a podcast all about the news and culture of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and other Mormon faiths. I am religion reporter Tamara Kimsley, and joining me is Senior Managing Editor David Noyce, who oversees our faith coverage. Hey, Dave.
Hi, Tamara.
Before we start, a quick ask. We invite you to go to patreon.com/MormonLand. That is patreon.com/MormonLand. And click on Become a Member. For as little as $3 a month, you can access all of the Tribune's faith coverage, podcast transcripts, and the full Mormon Land newsletter. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/MormonLand. And if you haven't already, follow us on Instagram at Mormon.land. Now for today's episode. A Latter-day Saint wants to invite her daughter's friend to join them for their congregation's annual Halloween trunk or treat. But it's being held in the parking lot of the church, and she worries the parents will think the invitation carries ulterior motives. Across the street, a couple plan a neighborhood dinner party. They want to throw the invite open to everyone, but there will be alcohol, and they fear offending their teetotaling Latter-day Saint neighbors. In the end, they opt to play it safe and invite only a few non-Latter-day Saint couples. The Salt Lake Tribune heard stories like this and more when nearly a quarter century it undertook no small task as an in-depth exploration of Utah's religious divide. And we heard them again when this year we solicited feedback from readers about how the dynamic shapes their own neighborhoods. Here to talk about their own observations of this unspoken divide are Latter-day Saint LaShawn Williams, a licensed clinical social worker with a doctorate in education, and Bob Goldberg, a U.S. historian, a member of Utah's Jewish community, and former director of the Tanner Humanities Center at the University of Utah. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And okay, let's start with just a gut check. So we heard from a lot of readers who spoke to a number of sort of observer types who all said that the LDS versus non-LDS divide is very real and shapes all kinds of interactions across the state. But we also talked to people who push back against this idea. They said that as far as they could tell, everyone gets along, especially, or at least in their neck of the woods. And I wanted to get a quick just sense from both of you. How pervasive do you believe the divide is? LaShawn, let's start with you.
Thank you. As an East Coast Mormon moving to Utah about 20 years ago, the idea of an LDS versus non-LDS divide, I think it's real. You know, it happens. I think when you have a place where you are the majority and you get to describe all the things and you get to kind of make the maps and whatnot, you pioneered your way in here, there will be a divide. Hopefully it's not a versus, us versus them, but I think it's a normal and natural thing that happens when communities are coming around each other and trying to figure out how are we going to interact. So yeah, it's there, not ideal, but it's present.
And what about you, Bob? Any thoughts?
Yes, I have some thoughts. I believe we live in a bipolar community, a very strong, integrated, self-contained tribe on the one side, and the other a diverse community of peoples. Protestants, Catholics, Jews, Muslims, secular people, Latinos, African Americans on the other side. And I find that the relationships between the two tribes are basically secondary relationships as opposed to primary relationships. By primary, I mean who you marry, who your best friends are kept within the separate tribes.
Let's drill down a little bit more on our series that we kicked off, LaShawn and Bob. In this first 6-part series where we looked at neighborhoods, first of several we plan on this divide, we focused on these neighborhoods. Do kids play together? What do neighborhood get-togethers look like? That sort of thing. How have each of you seen this play out in your own neighborhoods? LaShawn, do you want to start?
Yeah, so I'm a parent of 3 kids. I've been married and I'm not married anymore. And so noticing how things shift with who my kids play with in the neighborhood and who they don't, where community is built in because you go to church down the street with each other, and you can kind of lose that sense of community if you stop going to church down the street from each other. I think it does happen, and I see my kids looking for other ways to create community through sport, through things like school events, drama, theater, community sports, community service, going back to, not like non-Utah things, but like Girl Scouts was it for me on the East Coast, especially as a Southern girl, right? We did Girl Scouts, where here you've got Young Women's, and then, maybe you might do Girl Scouts, which you would think within the LDS Church how much we love sugar. Why are we not more of us Girl Scouts? Because that would be absolutely, like, I could donate tithing money to support the local Girl Scouts and get my annual fix of, my cookies. But we don't have a lot of like Latter-day Saint Girl Scouts. We have Girl Scouts, and then we have like Young Women's. And I don't think anyone outside of the divide ever questions that, but that's, I think, how it is here.
Do you mind me asking, because you brought this up, did your divorce change your position within the divide?
Yes. yes. I'm now the single mom of three project of each ward that I'm in. And that does change it changes the interaction, it changes the expectations, it changes perceptions and opinions once I invite people into my home to let them know who I actually am. But yeah, the divorce absolutely has an impact on how families are seen and what it means to have your kids contribute or participate based on the kind of family they come from. So Bob, you mentioned primary and secondary, right? These relationships that we have, we moved out of that primary into secondary, I think, because of the divorce.
Huh.
So, Bob, how have you seen the divide play out in your neighborhood?
Well, let me give you a little context to that.
Sure.
So when I moved here in 1980, my realtor said to me when we were looking for a house, she said, "Do you want to live in an integrated community?" And I said, "Yeah, sure. I have no problem with that. I'm from the East as well, ethnic groups, racial groups." She said, "No, that's not what I mean. What I mean is, do you want to live in a Mormon area or a non-Mormon area?"
different kind of.
We chose the Yale Harvard area. And then now I'm living in the Mount Olympus area, which are integrated areas. But that was from the very week I came here, an issue that was brought to my attention and my family's attention. And we have dealt with that kind of issue throughout. And what I can say now, living just around the corner is the Ward House, the social, religious, and cultural center for this Mormon community. There's very little interaction between Mormons and non-Mormons that I see. Curiously, there are 4 or 5 different Jews on this street, and I have greater interaction with them and the Greek community, a Greek family next door, than any other family around here.
Do you think one of the reasons is, and this came up in our reporting, of course, is Mormonism's a little bit more time commitment, I guess you could say, all-consuming nature. Do you think that's part of it or not?
I think that's a very important part. I look at Mormons as being in the world, but insulated in this world, that there are community centers around the ward, which is, I have no problem with that in any way, shape, or form. And their time is taken up by activities. And it is a time concentric community and a very faithful community as well.
LaShawn, I forgot to ask, and are you willing to share what town or what county that you live in?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I'm in Utah County, and I was just thinking about what you were saying, Bob, so far as the integrated neighborhoods, Mormon and non-Mormon. I think, and what I've experienced is living closer to a college campus has allowed me to experience more of the Mormon integrated community, more of the college professors, more people with life experiences. And I think living closer in Utah County to like UVU compared to BYU is even different so far as living next to a university and how that brings different sorts of people, ideas, and thinking and perspectives together. But I've seen there be benefits at times to the closer that you are living to an educational institution and the influx of people that will be in the community. I'm not far from Adobe and Silicon Slopes and everything happening in Utah County. So we've had this influx. And I think even, I remember when I randomly picked up the Utah County Neighbor magazine, and I saw the dividing economic line, which I know we'll get to soon, but Geneva Road is a road that divides like Old Orem from Vineyard, and Vineyard is like the new up and coming where everybody that works in Silicon Slopes lives. But the median income from Orem to Geneva is a difference of $60,000 and $96,000. And that sort of a thing plays a role, I think, too, in how communities connect, disconnect, reconnect, and repair.
And just one little thing I want to say in response to Sean. What I've also found is that those people with a great deal of education are not necessarily more tolerant than other people.
Agreed.
Do you want to unpack that? That's quite a tantalizing bit to just throw out there.
Well, that's what I do for a living. Okay, it's analyze. But I believe that we're going to be talking about university life and prejudice on university campuses. I do want to speak to that because it's something that I've seen and dealt with in the 40 years I was at the University of Utah.
Great. Yeah. And we will get to education both in this conversation and later as as the Salt Lake Tribune. We will be focusing, or our plan is at this moment to focus on a conversation specifically around education in our educational spaces. But want to go back to really quick neighborhoods. Is there any other way that the two of you see geography, different counties, rural versus urban, as playing into this?
I'd like to speak to that. And first of all, talk about what I'm going to call an unconscious Mormon authority that exists in this state. You know, we live every day. Our daily lives are governed by a Mormon grid. That is, every town and city in Utah, as we all know, radiates its streets from a central LDS building, whether a temple or a ward house or whatever. So our geography is very much Mormon-based. And then let's expand this a little more dramatically, because our creation story in this state is a Mormon story. The camp of Israel coming across through the wilderness, creating, finding a desert and making the desert bloom. Okay, that's our creation story. And then we can go back further, not too much context, but we can go back further and talk about a Dead Sea connected by a Jordan River to a freshwater lake. And we can talk about Moab and Nebo and what have you. But what our Pioneer Day is the reenactment of that creation story going back to biblical times, but infused with a Mormon tenor. So that governs all of these communities because that's how we live our daily lives.
And I think it's how we judge our goodness too. Like, oh, are you in one of the cities that's getting a new temple? Like everyone kind of gets these bragging rights based on where the next new temple is popping up. And then it's all of the hullabaloo around the temple, the open house, the invitation, all the things that start really structuring this identity as part of who we are, the status that we have, and the ways that I think we internally create more of this division between primary and secondary communities that you've mentioned before.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I want to talk about now shifting that. I know that these, it's somewhat artificial to try and separate these different spheres that we live in, the neighborhood versus the workplace versus the education space. But I do want to talk a little bit about that. But before we get into that, something that came up in our research over and over again was this idea of snow shoveling. And Dave, do you want to unpack that question a little bit?
Yeah, we were surprised by this. A number of readers, when we reached out about the divide, in quote marks, mentioned that they notice when there's a deep snow that happens, snowstorm happens, and they see members of the LDS congregation, usually youth, shoveling snow for non-members, for members, sometimes members who can't shovel their own snow, elderly, otherwise disabled. Then they stop at the non-member, the person who's not members, driveway. So it's very noticeable to them. Some complained about this, but many of them noticed it. What do you make of that? I mean, is there a deeper significance here than just snow? Bob, you want to take a swing at that first?
Well, let me first of all say that I live in a neighborhood that doesn't have many sidewalks, and there is a sidewalk on my block, and I do the snow shoveling of the entire block. Or then my neighbor does it if he or she gets up before I do. So I really can't speak to that divide. Where I see the divide is when the flags are planted on special holidays. Okay. And then you know who's Mormon and who isn't, as if you didn't know, but who is and who isn't.
That came up too. Yes, okay. Exactly.
I would love to be asked, do you want a flag on your lawn? I'd say, absolutely. I'm a patriot. I'm a liberal, but I'm a patriot. And but no one ever gets to around to ask me.
Oh, interesting. Wait,
take on this.
Hold on. I want to wait. So people assume that you don't want an American flag because they don't identify you as the church, or they just don't knock on your door because they don't know you?
Well, I maybe this is, I don't want to create a conspiracy theory here,
Fair.
but I'm convinced that the leadership of the ward knows that I'm Jewish, because I've never been visited by missionaries. Okay. And never have I been visited by missionaries, whether I lived near the university or in Mount Olympus. And I have to tell you, I very much appreciate not being disturbed. But I feel that there is a hidden knowledge in this community that knows who is and who isn't. Okay.
LaShawn, what's your take on this?
The snow shoveling thing is weird. I've seen it. But normally me and my kids are outside shoveling. But I can say that, like, the crosswalk guard, I live near an elementary school. I have seen him just randomly come, find a shovel on my porch, and just kind of shovel out the area. I mean, I walk my kids to school because we're right there. But people just have this entitlement, I guess, to serve others. And this idea, like, how does your service stop because they're not in the LDS Tools app? That doesn't really make sense. So then your service is more of a performance than an actual service. But, like, I think maybe people know not to come to my door because I'll say, you're just performing. Like, they know that conversation with me where I'm like, go do their yard too. Don't just do mine because you know me. If you want to go serve your neighbor, go love your neighbor and go love their yard too. Don't do this to me. Don't attach my name to this performance activity. Absolutely not.
Well, maybe they should change the name of the app from Just Serve to Just Shovel. I don't know, So.
Nice. I see what you just did there, Dave. So both of you have worked at educational universities, like we talked about before, Bob at the U, and then LaShawn down at UVU. So, LaShawn, I want to ask you how that divide was manifest at UVU and between among the student body, but among faculty and also students to faculty. And then also Bob as well. I'm really intrigued that, you have Bob, you're up there in Utah or Salt Lake County. LaShawn, you're down in Utah County. I'd love to hear both your experiences.
Thank you. So I've worked at a couple of higher ed institutions in the Utah system of higher education. I was at UVU, I was at Salt Lake Community College, I was at Utah State, up at the Logan campus, and any of our different regional campuses. And every single campus, I would get a story of so I taught social workers, and I was in higher ed for 19 years. And in every single class, we do some sort of tell your life story, like a biopsychosocial analysis or a narrative where they tell their story. Every story for 19 years, I always had a handful of students who grew up not LDS and in Utah, or who have grown up LDS and have left the church. All of them talk about the divide. The kids who grew up in Utah that weren't LDS, multiple stories, not invited to birthday parties, could not play at my friends' houses. My friends couldn't come play at my house because I didn't go to their church. Multiple stories every single year without fail for 19 years. Oddest thing for me to see. And then as a colleague in the workplace, I remember my stereotypes about Utah and Utah Mormons. Everyone's like holding hands and skipping to church and have their scriptures all the time. And it maybe didn't like play out like that in general. But when I saw regular non-Mormon of the world professional behavior Monday through Friday, and I knew on Sunday we sat in similar buildings, had similar lessons, did similar ordinances and sacraments and all that kind of stuff, the dissonance for me was, how dare you? How dare you come to work and behave this way and then profess that you are separate and apart and different or better than because of where you hang out on Sunday? So it was really dissonant for me as a professional, being Mormon, being a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. On the East Coast, we don't take things that seriously. I'm a Mormon. That's just who I am. But whatever. In Utah, do as we do. As a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that was major dissonance for me. Seeing what happened to my students, noticing what I experienced in the workplace. I could tell by people's voices. That's an Elders Quorum president. She's in Relief Society. I knew how people talked. The thing about me as a Black member, no one ever assumed that I was a member. I would have to share by code switching, by using similar language to let them know that I knew that I was a member. And so seeing it, and then my students to faculty, same sort of a thing. my students would talk about, oh, I served a humanitarian international mission. I'm like, oh, okay, cool. Where'd you serve? How long was the mission? I would have to use keywords to let my students know that I knew. And then once I did, our relationships would change. So it allowed a different level of accountability that I think I could use because we shared the same faith, but it also allowed a different kind of community and connection as well.
Bob, what about you at the U?
Okay. I came to Utah in 1980 for my interview at the University of Utah as an assistant professor of history. And note also, I am Jewish. I have lived in New York, Arizona, Colorado, California, and Texas, and then Utah. And I'm particularly sensitive to issues of discrimination and prejudice and bias because I believe prejudice against anyone tears at the social fabric. Prejudice against anyone, discrimination against anyone robs all of us of a piece of our humanity. I was picked up at the at the Salt Lake City airport in 1980, and this was my introduction to Utah. I was taken around the state, around the city. Here's the Capitol, here's this building, here's that. And then pointing to the temple downtown, the comment was, this is our version of Disneyland. And I thought, he doesn't know me from Adam. And this is my introduction. And then in the interview process, I'm told how the students are very submissive. The local culture keeps them back. They don't ask very questions. They're used to authoritarian discipline. And then when I was hired and then watching as we go through this, I watched hiring decisions which were made in a discriminatory way against Latter-day Saints. I'd go to parties and there would be alcohol, wine, or beer, but never any drinks that, no Diet Coke for Latter-day Saints. And that led me in the 1990s to give a talk at the University of Utah called Anti-Mormonism at the university, where I outlined 7 or 8 different things that I had experienced and seen in regard to attacks on faculty members and again, attacks on students. When I became the director of the Tanner Humanities Center, one of the things I did was create a Mormon Studies program at the U, which would create classes not simply for Latter-day Saint students, but for all students, because I always believe the basis of understanding one another is knowledge. We did that. We brought in major Latter-day Saint speakers. We created a Mormon Studies Fellowship. We honored Marlon Jensen with a fellowship in his name. And this was designed to change the attitude in the atmosphere. I look at the College of Humanities, which is one of the most liberal pieces of that campus. And I remember going to sensitivity trainings, one in regard to gay and lesbian, one in regard to transgender. And I then said, we need to have a sensitivity training in regard to religion. That was vetoed. But if you want to understand how intense anti-Mormonism can be and is, count the number of faculty members who are LDS at the University of Utah, particularly in social sciences and in humanities. And you would be stunned to see how liberal people are not.
So have you seen it change at the U? To your efforts and others at the U as it evolved? Because I know state lawmakers have pointed to that too at times, of course.
I have seen some evolution. I've seen people, part of it is people wouldn't talk in front of me anymore because they knew how I felt. But I'll just give you an example. When the Tanner Humanities Center was reviewed at the end of my 13 years as director, one of the recommendations was to get rid of the Mormon Studies program. And in fact, the next director at the Mormon Studies program at the Tanner Humanities Center did exactly that. So yes, I think there's change. Yes, I think there's more awareness. Yes, I think there's more silence. But I think some of the same attitudes exist because they still live in Utah. And I remember one of the selling points when I was hired and all throughout was, hey, we're near a Delta hub. And the Delta hub gets you back into the world and away from this place.
How much of that do you think is driven by, or this came up in, we solicited responses from our readers, right? And we heard I read between 300 and 400. And then I started reaching out to people and then talked to the people they suggested. So I'm not really sure how many people I heard from, but it was in the hundreds. And often, I did come across quite a bit anti-Mormon rhetoric where it wasn't just about the divide, but it did get specifically at words like cult and talked about practices and beliefs in a negative tone. Where do you think this comes from? One of the areas that, or one of the things that a trend I found was that when people did have these anti-Mormon, anti-Latter-day Saint views, they often would bring in the legislature, the state legislature, very quickly as a source of their rancor. But I'm curious to your observations, either of you.
Well, I think there's certainly a political aspect to this. I think there's a cultural aspect to this. I think that I'm not a Latter-day Saint, but I would assume that Latter-day Saints wonder and worry that they're being challenged or that there's discrimination against them. And I don't think they realize how, again, pervasive Mormonism is in this state. I just want to give you one other little example. The beehive. The beehive, which has been called by Mormon leaders as a symbol of the community, the coat of arms, if you will. It's on the state flag. It's on the University of Utah and BYU seal. It's on state highway markers. We have a baseball team called the Bees. Okay, it's all over the place, and I don't think Latter-day Saints realize how intense that environment is. And I think many people, whether they come from the East or the West, who are involved in many more multicultural activities or multicultural environments, realize how monolithic this community can be. And I have seen dramatic changes, particularly since the 1990s, dramatic changes, demographic changes. Obama won Salt Lake City. Clinton won Salt Lake City. Biden won Salt Lake City. And Harris is going to win Salt Lake City. But once you step out of Salt Lake City proper, the world changes. And I think it is a reflection, some of these attitudes are a reflection of the pervasiveness of Mormon culture and society.
You've been nodding. Yeah, I was going to say, LaShawn, you've been nodding a lot. Let's hear it.
I've been nodding enthusiastically over here. So I lived in Pennsylvania before I came to Utah. And to this idea that, in certain areas, you've got a community where you can nod your head and you can be in agreement. Friends and I, we would say between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, it's Mississippi. So you need to be careful, right? And not that between Salt Lake and, St. George, it's Mississippi, but it is rural. And I think there's this element of like Western identity. There's this element of we did this, we're here. There's this element of what does it mean to kind of maintain safety? And so like mental health wise, people will say things like cults because we're not really good at differentiation as a community. Doesn't mean we're a cult. It just means that we're not used to being able to have our own separate identity because of the communal nature of Mormon culture. And so when people aren't super versed in that, they're not going to see it. But now when you have folks that are mentioning things like cult and legislature, higher ed right now, all of our anti-DEI legislation is coming from Mormon legislators. And that's a conversation that I doubt that we will be able to have effectively, but it's absolutely one that I think we should be able to have, where I think the accountability of the faith and of the treating everyone as equal, we say the same words, but we have different experiences with those words. And there are going to be very faithful Latter-day Saints who believe that all are like unto God, so far as the scripture means taking away DEI. And there are going to be some who believe all are alike unto God means keeping DEI in universities and schools in the education system. So we've got this element of like symbolic interactionism. We see the same thing, but we have different definitions and different experiences. And there's more that I can say around seeing Mormons kind of experiencing discrimination and oppression. But briefly, one of the things that I'll say is this. When I would use Mormonism as a talking point, especially for my Mormon kids around diversity, equity, inclusion, things like that, I always talked to my return missionaries in the classroom and I said, what was the hardest part of your mission? And they would mention it, like they served internationally, or they served in Chicago, Detroit, Atlanta. They'd bring up these black areas to me specifically. And it was so hard. And I was discriminated against because I was white. I said, how long was your mission? 2 years. I said, it had a beginning. They said, yep. I said, it had a middle. When you knew you were about to go home, you got trunky, and it had an end, right? They said, yeah. I said, what we are dealing with diversity is the middle. Every community that you're going to work in as a social worker, there's a beginning of the story, and right now we're all in the middle. You are lucky and you are in a position to help because your mission ended. But were you changed? Have you come back here ready to put an ending to the oppression and the experiences that folks are suffering because you experienced it for 2 years, 18 months, sister, 18 months, elder, 18 months to 2 years of your life, right? Did you experience it, and have you come home changed? Because that was the connection point. That was the call to action that I could use with my students so that really this faith became more of a performance and absolutely an embodied identity. Does that make sense?
And I want to unpack that a little bit because race and economic divide, absolutely, based on the conversations that we had, plays into this LDS versus non-LDS divide in really kind of sometimes scrambling, but then also times reinforcing some of these identities and communities. Wondering if you could speak to that, LaShawn and Bob.
Very briefly, I think race and income and how it impacts the identity of people is, for those of us who are marginalized, we have to let people know that we're Mormon. And then if you play your cards correctly and you Mormon well enough, your income can and will be impacted. I've seen it. I have not experienced it as of yet, but I've seen it happen where we use the markers to say safety or not safe, and then we choose who we're going to bring in to keep safe and to help people advance.
I want to comment on that idea of safety. Sean, thank you. It's a really interesting point you raised. This is a state which is, and I'm going to use the expression, philo-Semitic. You've all heard the expression anti-Semitic, but philo-Semitic. So I have never experienced anti-Semitism on the part of Latter-day Saints in the 40-something years I've lived here. I've experienced it in other communities in the state. And I just want to emphasize that point because living here as a Jew has been incredibly easy. And it will continue to be easy because there is this identity. As Ezra Taft Benson said, we're biblical cousins. Whether that's the case or not, I don't want to get into that, okay? But I just want to emphasize that goes through any of the barriers that we're talking about, whether it's class or gender or whatever.
I want to turn to another topic now, even though there's a lot we could say on that. That could be a whole show, of course, race and income. But high-ranking church leaders, LDS leaders, have spoken out about the need for church members to reach out, get to know their neighbors for no other reason than building a relationship with them. At the same time, it's an openly missionary-minded faith that encourages its members to share its gospel and seek converts. How can or should members balance those dual, seemingly competing messages? LaShawn?
Be a good person. People will come to you if they want to find Jesus. If they don't want to find Jesus, they'll find what works for them. But let them find you and be a good person because that's who you are. There's no performance necessary to be good, to be kind, and to be connected in our communities.
Bob, what about you?
I want to speak to this issue because it's very important. It's a great question, David. My mentors in this state have been Latter-day Saints. I have very close LDS friends. These are people who respect who I am and what I am. I find incredibly offensive what I call objectification, that I am the object of a conversion attempt or experience. It makes me furious because it shows no respect for who I am or what I am and what I believe. And I definitely believe that church leaders need bridle their people, harness their people to the good, because how it's working now is not working.
Well, what should non-members do if they're approached that way?
I can tell you what I've done, which is I say, I am Jewish. I am proud of my tradition. I am proud of my community. And I appreciate what you want, what you believe in, what your goals and your aspirations are. But you need to, and I'll use the expression I used, back off.
Have you seen friendships lost because of that? Or LaShawn, if that happens?
I think we have to tell members to leave the check boxes alone. And we, as non-members and folks that are outside of the faith, wherever we may be, I think just remind people of their humanity. right? Maybe you feel like you're Mormon first, but come be my neighbor. Come hang out. What can you tell me that you think might benefit me in parenting? What can you tell me that might benefit, like my yard work? Don't use your passive aggressive care for wanting to serve me to be the reason that you want to come clean up my lawn because you think I don't take good care of it. Like, there's a difference there. There's a balance. And I think we can invite people to connect with us and our humanity and invite them to live their faith in that way.
But it sounds like something, Bob, especially that you're iterating. If you're interested, you'll initiate the conversation.
Of course. And I am interested. And as I tell my Latter-day Saint friends, I've tried to read the Book of Mormon 5, 10, 15 times. I just can't get past page 8 because there are too many, for me, errors by page 8. But what I wanted to say about this is I have many LDS friends. My closest friends are LDS, okay? And I love them. They have never intruded upon me and attempted to say in any way, shape, or form, you're less than. You need to believe this, okay? Mm-hmm. And I'll say also, when those people do attempt to press me, those relationships end.
I'm going to ask a question on a different front now. You both have been here at least for some time, Bob, even longer, in Utah. I want to give an assessment of the divide now. Do you believe as Utah continues to diversify, has a very rich interfaith community, but there's no doubt that Latter-day Saints are the predominant faith still and culture, yet there's also increased polarization in our time right now. Do you believe the religious divide is growing wider? Or are people growing closer together right now in Utah? Sean, do you want? Bob, go ahead. You can start.
We found a common cause: Latter-day Saints and non-Latter-day Saints, and that common cause has been economic development. I am amazed at how much change has occurred through economic infrastructure, apartments. The new sporting adventure is what I'll call it. And what that has done is made major demographic changes in this community. It has brought in people who are not Latter-day Saints. It has brought in Latinos. It has brought in gay and lesbian folks. It's brought in a diversity of people. And I think that is definitely what's needed. Because remember, we have a state where every single state office is held by a Latter-day Saint. And we need to see that demography make changes in the culture and in the society. And I want to quote Carolyn Tanner Irish. She was the Episcopal bishop in Salt Lake City. And she said, we don't have to see eye to eye to stand shoulder to shoulder. And I think that's where we are in changing this community. And I think the changes are going to come through capitalism and economic development.
LaShawn, how do you see it right now in Utah?
Right now in Utah, I think I see more division happening at times, but you have to remember I'm a mental health professional, and so the things that I hear in my therapy office will be very different than what we hear outside. I think what I will do is just, kind of throw a little bit of caution, right? Because as we're developing all these big, beautiful things, it reminds me of the scene in The Wizard of Oz. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. The great and powerful Wizard of Oz is what's happening. And so as we have all these things to entertain and to make money and to build business, people will feel like, okay, but we're doing that to ignore the human experiences, our suicide rates, our LGBTQ communities, anti-trans legislation, racism, discrimination, police brutality. Like, as we're, I want to go to a soccer game too, but can I survive a traffic stop along the way is going to come up for some communities. And I think it's those places where we experience these divisions that we just don't have the language and the psychological safety to discuss. But I believe hand in hand, if we try, we can stumble forward and find stability eventually.
And I think a key to that is the role of the First Presidency. I was at a meeting where President Nelson said, we need to build bridges, not walls. And I said to myself, would he only say that in a conference or 2 or 3? But that is the mentality. When he got vaccinated with the COVID crisis, that was an act of humanity, which was a beautiful event. That is something that needs to be done by the leadership of this community, because the leadership of this community, the LDS leadership community, is so influential, and in their hands, they hold the future.
So are the run-of-the-mill people in the pews LDS or those? It's tricky because I know it's not great, I'm sure, to be referred to as simply a non-LDS, right? That's not a super term.
It's like the anti-federalists. Okay?
So the rest of that, glorious, diverse humanity that is so is throughout Utah. Are they helpless? Are we helpless? Or what can we do? Both those who are members of the church and those who are not.
I look at the event during the Korean War when the United States Army was segregated and the communists were pushing down the peninsula, and American Army was throwing anybody and everybody. And they said, we're taking white soldiers and black soldiers and brown soldiers, and we're just putting them in there to hold the line. And there's great fear. There were going to be race riots. And what they found is when people work at a common task, where they see the good of the whole, when they're on an equal level, peace does reign, cooperation does occur. And I think that's what's crucial here, is that whether it's through economic development or humanitarian change or charitable work, when people are together working as equals, that understanding comes.
LaShawn.
I agree. I think it's possible. I think it takes soul searching. I think there are a couple midnights of the soul a lot of us need to sit with. We've heard President Nelson, who within Mormon speak, he's a prophet for our times. It's beautiful to have had a medical doctor as the prophet, the president of the church during an international pandemic. If secession continues, we will have a lawyer that leads the church through times of big constitutionality and constitution conversations. And so the idea that the church feels like it's always prepared to lead, I think a better searching of our souls to see what our leadership truly means, and that we're bringing everyone along elbow to elbow and shoulder to shoulder. I think it means that as churches, as people of faith, how can we get together in this fabric of humanity? What does that look like? How do we use that universal principle of loving our neighbors to really bring us together and to understand that loving my neighbor in this direction doesn't mean I love this neighbor less. It's not a zero-sum game. We all have an abundance of love that if we decide how we're going to show it and embody it, we really can make those changes. It will be hard, but it will be worth it. And I believe that that's what we're all here to do as people of faith. And even if that's faith in nature, faith in self, faith in nothing, we've got humanity to bind us.
Well said. Thank you both for.
And in this, the church has got to shorn itself of any fear of its own members. And what I mean by that is the church has easily moved to cut off its liberal and left wings. But it's also got to confront the conservative part and the very right. And to say to them, this is not what Jesus would do. Okay? This is not what Jesus wants. And if you're walking with Jesus, you walk a different path.
Thank you both, LaShawn Williams and Bob Goldberg. Thank you for joining us. And thanks to Dave. Yeah, this was fun. And thanks to Dave Noyce and to our producer, Chris Samuels. We remind our listeners that you can keep up with all of the happenings in and about the church. Just subscribe to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.